Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm doing something different. I'm doing my top 25 beat 'em ups of all time. Now, a beat 'em up back in the day, we called them fighting games before the games we call today fighting games came on the scene. Sometimes we called them brawlers. Now, beat 'em up comes from a book by what's his name? Jeff Rovine, I think, called How to Win at Nintendo, where he categorized games as shoot 'em ups, beat 'em ups, puzzle games, and questionable titles along those lines. And somewhere magazines and eventually internet nerd culture gamers alike somehow adopted that moniker as the how we describe side-scrolling fighting games, because once the one-on-one fighting game became established with Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, etc., Street Fighter 2 specifically, we couldn't call these games fighting games anymore because it was confusing. But we did call them fighting games back in the day. We didn't call them beat 'em ups or brawlers or whatever. So I'm using the term beat 'em up. So we've got 25 here. There's some games on this list you're going to recognize. There might be some games on this list that you're going to go, wait, what? There's not likely any and or very many games on this list you've never heard of. This is probably games you know, have played, or own in your collection, digitally or otherwise. So number 25, this game was released on the Sega Genesis and the Super NES. It's identical on both systems. So whichever one you get is good. Whichever one you own is good. It's the same game. This game is called it's called Maximum Carnage. I think it's called Spider-Man something Maximum Carnage, but I don't remember. I think Maximum Carnage is the subtitle, but I don't remember. But we're just going to call it Maximum Carnage. This is a beat 'em up based on a comic book property, Spider-Man, where you can play as either the titular Spider-Man or as Venom. The game is mostly a single player romp, but it does support two-player action. This game's notable because you have spiderweb capabilities, wall crawling capabilities with both characters. Venom is bigger, so he takes more damage and deals more damage. So if you play as Venom, he's harder to kill, and he does more damage. So you can get further in the game playing as Venom, but you can't start out as Venom. You have to unlock him, I guess. But it's still a hella fun game, and it looks amazing even by today's standards. It's got great graphics. Number 24 was exclusive to the Super NES, technically. Now, there is, I believe, a game on the Genesis by the same name, but it's a different game. This is Batman Returns, based on the movie by Tim Burton, Batman Returns. Great game, but we're talking about the Super Nintendo version. This is the one people played. This is the one people remember. Again, very good graphics, very good representation of the movie, fun gameplay, great music. This is what you want from a beat 'em up. Number 23, I believe existed as an arcade game, as the title of the game implies, but it was also on the Sega Saturn. Now, this one's unique. This is Die Hard Arcade. This one's unique because it's in 3D. Not 3D like gimmicky put on the glasses 3D. I mean like today's video games are 3D because it's in a 3D world, in a 3D space. It's playable. Now, the only reason why it's higher on the list than these other two is because it's unique being 3D. And also, it's a fun game. And also, it's on the Sega Saturn, which I've got to give props to the Sega Saturn because I love the Sega Saturn. It's one of my favorite game consoles of all time. Number 22, I know was on the GameCube, and I know 100% it was on the PS2. It may have had a PC port. I'm not 100%. And I don't know if it had an Xbox port or not. OG Xbox, as we have to call it because of Microsoft's bullshit naming conventions. But this game is called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It was released in, I believe, 2003, based on the 2002 reboot TMNT cartoon of the same name. This is a fucking glorious game. However, I have issues with it. This was by Konami, who were known for making fantastic TMNT based beat 'em ups, arcade and NES games, Super NES games, Genesis games back in the day. Inexplicably did not release any on the PlayStation or Saturn. I can understand why there were no N64 games, but come on. There should have been something on the Saturn or PlayStation, even if it was just a compilation of the previous two arcade games. Should have been something. But anyways, this game's pretty fun. However, as you probably know, the PS2, which was a two-controller port console, was a massive success, and every game that got made back then was put on the PlayStation. In this instance, made for the PlayStation and then ported to the other consoles. The reason why this bothers me is because the GameCube, PC, Xbox, and PS2, if you had a multi-tap, could support 4-player games. And they could easily support a 4-player game of this nature because they did. So the fact that you could play as any of the four turtles, but only two at a time, at most, is bullshit because they butchered this game to make it for PS2 and then ported it to everything else. Now, this game's got a lot of cutscenes from the cartoon, which your mileage may vary depending on how you feel about cartoons at all, or that cartoon in particular. However, the gameplay is all you want. It's solid gameplay. Moving on. Number 21, Double Dragon 2, the arcade version. Specifically, the arcade version. This game took everything that was great about Double Dragon and just cranked it up. And this is probably one of the better Double Dragon games. Not the best of the best, but one of the better ones. But it's a great game. Not as memorable as the original, but still a fun game. Number 20 was a launch title, pack-in some cases, for the Sega Genesis, and was also an arcade game originally. The Genesis port is actually pretty good, all things considered. Is it 100%? No, but nothing was back then. We didn't care back then. It didn't have to be 100%. It was good enough. It was like 90% faithful to the arcade, which is good enough. The game is called Altered Beast. Now, this game is at this point on the list. If I was ranking this based on my love for the game, it would be higher because I'm a Sega nerd. My online handle, my Steam handle is Sega Gamer 12. So I'm a big Sega nerd. So I loved this game back in the day because it was impressive at the time. Not by today's standards, but at the time it was impressive. And was one of the games that sold me on a Genesis because it wasn't on Super Nintendo, and there weren't a lot of good fighting games or action games or beat 'em ups on the Super Nintendo. There were some, but there were more of them and better ones by and large in general on the Sega Genesis. Number 19 is more or less an arcade exclusive. I say more or less because the arcade game has been ported to modern consoles in some fashion, but it's just the ROM. It's just an emulation. It's not a port. It's a port, but it's literally just emulation. It's not a recode, if that makes sense. This is Dungeons and Dragons Tower of Mystara. Pretty good game. Not the greatest beat 'em up, fantasy beat 'em up, but good enough to make the list. Not as good as number 18, which is an even better fantasy themed beat 'em up, which was also released in arcades that did have a Super Nintendo port, but let's be real, you want the arcade version. The Super Nintendo port was subpar at best. This is Knights of the Round. Great fucking game. Number 17 is a Sega exclusive, as in it was made by Sega, like Altered Beast. It was released in the arcades, ported to home consoles, and re-released on modern systems, usually the Genesis port, but I do believe you can get the arcade port on modern consoles, but don't quote me on this because I'm not 100%. This game is Golden Axe. Golden Axe to me is, to use a pun, I guess, the gold standard for how to do a fantasy themed beat 'em up. Number 16 is another Sega one. Inexplicably, this game was not released in arcades, which it should have been because Sega were, at the time, the king of arcades, and still are today because it's the cornerstone of their business. And they're one of, like, I think 3 or 4 companies that still make arcade games. Good quality arcade games, but I digress. This game was released, however, on the Sega Genesis, and it was a damn good game. Better than most of the beat 'em ups on the Genesis up to this point. And not only set the standard of how to do a beat 'em up, it reinvented the genre and went on to spawn multiple sequels. This is Streets of Rage. This alone, single-handedly, rises the Genesis beat 'em up library above the Super NES library by at least 10 notches. It elevates the Genesis to the beat 'em up console, whereas the Super Nintendo was, yeah, I guess. Number 15 is an interesting game because it's a sequel. It was on the NES. It's a sequel to an arcade game, but not the sequel that was released on arcades, which is weird because it's a TMNT game. This is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project on the NES. Now, this is a direct sequel to the NES port of TMNT, the arcade game, which the arcade version, the actual arcade game, got its own sequel in Turtles in Time. But like I said, it's confusing. But anyways, this game is notable because one, the music is fucking awesome. And two, it gave the Turtles new special moves, which allowed them to be more ninja-like than previous games had. They always had their weapons. They always had the jump kick. They always had the sweep move. But this one gave them special ninja moves, which were unique to each turtle and were really pretty cool. This one actually felt like a ninja game, not just a Turtles game. Number 14, slightly better in a lot of ways, partially because the arcade game it's based on is fucking goddamn awesome, but also because, the music is dope as shit. This is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game for the NES. Again, not a pure, straight 100% port of the arcade game. They did the best they could graphically, gameplay wise. It's as close to the arcade as you can get due to the limitations of the technology. However, they made up for it by giving us bonus levels with its own bonus level background music, which is awesome. And so it definitely is a worthwhile game in your collection. Number 13 is interesting. It's not unique, but it's interesting because it was released primarily on the Nintendo Entertainment System, which most people who played it remember it as an NES game. However, it was also simultaneously released on the Sega Genesis, so those lucky kids that had a Genesis were able to experience a better port or version of this game. but they're both good. The NES is the one. The NES port's the one people remember, but the Genesis version is good too. Actually better. And when I replay this game, I play the Genesis version, not the NES version, because the Genesis pad is actually comfortable and fits in your hand, and the NES pad just gives you blisters. This is Batman from 1989, loosely based on the Tim Burton movie, based on the comics. Now, this game kind of follows the movie, but also takes liberties, which is what makes it good. Number 12, same exact situation. It was released on the NES, but also released on the Genesis. And spoilers, did not get a Super Nintendo port because by the time the Super Nintendo came out, Sega came first. This game was old hat. But this game is one where I'm going to reverse what I just said, and I'm going to say the NES version is the one you want to play because the Genesis version does nothing different. It doesn't even change the graph. It's not even better graphics. It's literally the same fucking game. And this is a case where the game suffers from the Genesis D-pad, and it plays better on the NES because the NES happens to have a better functioning D-pad, unfortunately. The Genesis pad is better than in other ways, but that D-pad is atrocious. I'm just going to be real. This game is Battletoads. Great game. This is a TMNT knockoff, and it was created to be a TMNT knockoff. But it's a damn fun game. Number 11, I don't know if it has an arcade port or not, so, don't quote me on this. But it's a game in a franchise that had multiple arcade releases. Now, this game was on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. It's more or less the same game on both systems from what I've played of it. This is Double Dragon 5. Now, you could just dismiss it as just another Double Dragon. However, this one is like Double Dragon perfected. They finally got the formula down and said, look, let's just cut the bullshit and make a fun game. And they did. Number 10 is the only one from the Wii U to make this list. And as far as I can tell, remains a Wii U exclusive to this day, although I haven't looked into it too much. So don't quote me on this. I don't know if it's on the Switch or anything else. But last time I checked, which wasn't that long ago, I don't think, a couple years ago maybe, it wasn't on the Switch, or I didn't see it listed as on. Anyways, this is the Wonderful 101. Now, this one's unique in a lot of ways. Like Die Hard, this is a modern game. So it's 3D. It exists in a 3D space. This one's also a lot of fun because it doesn't hold back. It just drops you in and says, let's beat shit up and fucking go. From the word go. It's like, fuck yes, this is what I want. If you haven't played the Wonderful 101, I don't know what to tell you because the Wii U is not worth the price it's fetching on eBay. I'm sorry. You should have bought it when it was new. You missed your opportunity. So you're SOL. But if it does exist on other consoles, which I don't know if it does, or maybe a PC port, that's your better option. Or if you go the piracy route, you can emulate this game pretty easily. I'm not going to tell you how. You can figure it out on your own. Number 9 is another one that did make its way to the GameCube. I don't know if this game was ported to PS2 or not. This was among the Capcom games that was supposed to be exclusive to the GameCube. I don't think it was a part of the Capcom 5, which is a topic I'm going to do a video on. I'm going to do a whole video on the Capcom 5. But for now, I'm just going to talk about Beautiful Joe, which it is a goddamn travesty this game has not had a modern HD port. Or sequels for that matter. Which leads me to believe it was a GameCube exclusive. because that's the only explanation I have for why it most likely bombed. Because it was hard to sell games on the GameCube because nobody bought the GameCube. I did when it was fairly new. I bought it when it was still current gen. And I love it, and it's my favorite game console of all time to this day, and I am still sad that I do not have a GameCube. I'm tempted to sell my PS3 to buy a GameCube. I'm tempted. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting close. Even though I have 100 games digitally on my PS3, I would gladly trade it in for a GameCube just for like 5 games. This game is, it's fun. It's a good game. But I'll be honest, this game mostly stands out because it was a breakout hit on the GameCube that didn't really sell systems, but made GameCube gamers happy. Because this is the kind of game we wanted on our GameCube. Now, again, I don't know if this game was ported to PS2, and I don't care. If it was, good for me because I own a PS2. I can probably buy it and still play it. If it wasn't, like I said, someday I'll get another GameCube. Unless you happen to love me enough to you have a spare one you want to send me as a gift, I won't say no. Anyways, number 8 is Streets of Rage 3. This is another one that stands above the rest. Again, this is Sega doing what they do well, which is make arcade games, even though this was an arcade game on the Genesis. The Genesis was an arcade in your living room when it was released, and that's what it was sold to us as, and it delivered. It was an arcade in the living room, especially if you were like me and you had the arcade pad. Fuck yeah, the arcade joystick. Fuck yeah. I also miss the Genesis for different reasons. Number 7 is very unique in a lot of ways because it's another, I believe Konami, but don't quote me. It could have been Capcom, but I'm pretty sure it was Konami because they had the license, I think, at the time. They released a lot of games on the home consoles, but this is The Simpsons, the arcade game. Now, this is, I'm going to be honest, the best video game ever released to utilize the Simpsons franchise or license. If you're only going to play one Simpsons video game, this is the one you're going to play. I played this game in the arcade so much. I probably dropped, no joke, $200 or $300 worth of quarters in this machine. Don't ask me how I got those quarters. I did a lot of, can I have a quarter, please? I did a lot of begging. I dug in a lot of couch cushions. I walked around and stuck my finger in every machine that had a coin slot, whether it was a payphone or a laundry machine at the laundromat or whatever. If it had a coin slot, I stuck my finger in there praying to the gods that it had a quarter in it. And sometimes I'd get lucky and go drop it in this machine. However, number 6, as much as I played Simpsons Arcade, I played this one that much more. I cannot fathom how much money I dropped into this machine over the years. More so as an adult, which I was fortunate enough to live in a city that still had an arcade with this game in it. So I was able to put quarters in it when I had the money to do so. This is one of a handful of arcade machines I would buy and put in my house if I had the money and the space. This is, much like the Simpsons arcade game, a fan-fucking-tastic port of a franchise license. This is the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game. Not Turtles in Time. Not Turtles in Time. This is the first one. Number 5 is another travesty in that this is a great fucking game. One of the best beat 'em ups I've ever played that was only ever released in arcades. To my knowledge, never had a contemporary home port. And again, to my knowledge, has not been re-released on modern consoles. So emulation is the only way to go unless you have access to an arcade somewhere in your town or city that happens to have the machine in its catalog. This is Alien versus Predator. This is probably one of the greatest beat 'em ups of all time and one of the greatest licensed games of all time. And aside from a couple of stinkers, somehow the Alien franchise has spawned some tremendously great video games, which I'll have to do a whole video on the Alien video game franchise because holy shit, most of them are damn good. This one is no exception. This is one of the best games you're going to play. Number 4 is weird. It was an arcade game. It kind of, sort of, had a Super Nintendo port, but let's sweep it under the rug and pretend like it didn't, because the SNES port is rubbish. So much so that they had to re-release it to fix all the parts that were bullshit of the first one. This is Final Fight. Now, Final Fight is, I'll say it, not as good as Streets of Rage, but higher on the list because of 2 reasons. One, it was an arcade game, Streets of Rage wasn't, and I'm a sucker for arcade beat 'em ups. If I'm gonna play a beat 'em up, I want a joystick and face buttons that click, and I want to bash the shit out of the controller. You don't want to do that with your home controller. One, because it's yours, you paid money for it, and you don't want to have to replace it. And 2, the buttons aren't as responsive. They're not as clicky. They're a little mushy on home consoles, which I don't mind, but I want the clicky arcade buttons. Final Fight is a fantastic game with tremendously good graphics, great gameplay, and was, let's be real, the inspiration for Streets of Rage in the first place. Number 3 is going to have people scratching their heads because I'm talking about the arcade version, not the illegitimate rubbish NES port, which is fine as an NES title, but not fine as a beat 'em up, if that makes sense. If you're going to play this game, you need to play the arcade version. Now, it might have, to my knowledge, been ported to other consoles. I think there's a Sega Genesis port, but don't quote me on this. But this is the original Double Dragon. Now, Double Dragon didn't necessarily invent the beat 'em up, but it might as well have, because it was the first one to do it right and do it justice. And most beat 'em ups that came after were heavily inspired by, if not just ripping off, Double Dragon. Also, to its credit, Double Dragon was good enough to spawn a toy license, a animated cartoon, and, I'll say it, a really good, if not cheesy, live action movie. Which, yes, 90s cheesy, but hella fun. Double Dragon, fuck yeah. Number 2 only edges Double Dragon 1, just the arcade version, just a little bit, even though this does not have an arcade port to my knowledge. This was a Super Nintendo / Sega Genesis game. It edges the original Double Dragon just for one reason. And I'm going to say the name, and that's all you need to know about it. This is Double Dragon versus Battletoads. This is the ideal beat 'em up because it takes 2 fan-fucking-tastic beat 'em up franchises and meshes them together really well. Not good enough on its own to stand out on the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis compared to the other games in their library, but as a beat 'em up, it stands out above the rest. There's one game to make the number 1 spot. By far, by a mile, by 5 miles at least, the greatest beat 'em up of all time, the best beat 'em up I've ever played. It is a Sega Genesis game. Again, no arcade port. It has had modern re-releases, so you can get it on modern consoles. The greatest beat 'em up of all time, and this game is so great, nothing has ever come close. Nothing ever will come close. It's motherfucking Streets of Rage 2. This is a gift from the gods. It was written in heaven and handed to us by the angels of whichever religion you believe in. The universe said, "You're welcome, humans." This is the greatest fucking beat 'em up ever to exist. Nothing will ever come close. Nothing will ever touch it. Even the sequels and spin-offs and everything else are just trying to recreate the magic this game gave us. And this is one of the greatest games on the Sega Genesis, consequentially. And it's a great fucking game. If you haven't played Streets of Rage 2, you are missing out and have never played a great. You played good beat 'em ups, for sure, but you've never played a great beat 'em up. Because as far as I'm concerned, this is the only one to achieve great status. As in, this game alone transcends the beat 'em up genre and exists as a great video game in its own right. Stay cool.